It took weeks for the shock of what happened to Preston Jarvis to wear thin enough for Hannah and I to even think about what to do next. We both tried talking to Sarah about it, but the little girl we'd raised seemed to have evaporated that night, along with Preston. Her eyes showed no joy, no love, no hope. Nothing but emptiness. We attempted a few times to talk to Sarah about the incident, but it was obvious we couldn't get through to her. When we asked her what exactly happened to Preston, her answer was always different variations of, "I made him go away." She never said she killed him, and I suppose that wasn't entirely inaccurate, but she also said she couldn't bring him back. I'm not sure whether I believed that she couldn't undo what she'd done. At this point, I wasn't sure if she was incapable of anything, or if it was more that she wouldn't undo what she'd done. I'm not sure which option terrified me more. Sarah kept to herself even more than she had in the past. Before, Hannah and I could always carry conversations with her and get her to join us on trips to the store, but now she was nearly impossible to even get out of her bedroom for dinner. We would go days without seeing her. We only knew she was all right because we could hear her moving around in her bedroom, and the plates of food Hannah would leave in the hallway would be emptied by morning. I tried to stay up late once to see if I could catch Sarah coming out of her bedroom, but I'd fallen asleep around 3 a.m, and by the time I'd woken up, the food was gone. Every night the scene replayed over and over in my mind. When I closed my eyes, I could see the trees silhouetted in the dark, feel my heart racing, hear the terrified final screams of the boy who would be wiped from existence in mere seconds. I had hated that kid. It was hard to deny after the torment and pain he'd caused my family, but I wouldn't have wished his fate on anyone. I tried to tell myself that maybe things were better off this way. Maybe Preston would grow up to be a serial killer or something, but I knew in my heart that was probably not the case. Sarah had an effect on people that brought out the worst in them. Preston was a terrible kid, but would things have been different had his family not moved down the street from ours? Would he not have acted so maliciously if he hadn't been exposed to Sarah? There was no way to know for sure, but these questions are the ones that kept me up at night. That was until the shock had worn off enough for me to finally consider the 2 questions that I'd been too afraid to broach. Was this the first time she'd done this? And would she do something like this again? I had a thought cross my mind in the wee hours of the morning, after all but the raccoons and crickets had gone to sleep. Originally, there had been 3 boys that tormented Sarah. The other 2 had allegedly moved away, but I hadn't seen a moving van. All we had to go by was the account of the bored and nosy neighbours on our street. I spent days thinking about this before I finally decided to find out for myself. If the Francis and Ryan families really had moved, their houses would be empty. If they hadn't, well, I waited until Hannah and Sarah were asleep. I had no intention of telling either of them anything until I had a solid conclusion. As much as I loved Hannah, she wasn't always good at keeping things from Sarah. She didn't have the same focus I did, I suppose. I didn't blame her for that, but it meant I had to be careful with what I told her. At around 3, I got out of bed and slipped on my shoes. The street was illuminated by the street lamps, spaced a few houses apart, and the moon above cast an ominous glow around me as I stepped out into the July night. I put my hands in my pockets and began to stroll down the sidewalk. I badly wanted to run, to get there and be done with the whole business as quickly as possible, but I knew if someone did see me, a man running in the middle of the night seemed a bit more suspicious than someone going on a late night stroll. It must have been only 10 or 15 minutes before I approached the house where Austin Francis had once lived. The yard was mostly dirt, with only a few patches of grass here and there, all framed by a silver chain-link fence that once kept Bear the Rottweiler from terrorising the town. I opened the gate and approached the window. I didn't need to enter the house, just needed to see inside, but unfortunately, the curtains were drawn and all I was able to glimpse was a wall of black. I walked the perimeter of the house and attempted another window. Still, there was nothing to see but darkness. Sighing, I allowed myself one last attempt before I went to the Ryan household. I tried the knob on the back door. It twisted, and the door opened with a soft creak that sent my heart pounding. I stepped in and was immediately hit by the acrid scent of decaying meat. I turned on the lights and was unsurprised to find that there was no power. Using the flashlight on my phone, I toured the house. Bowls and plates still sat out on the kitchen table. The food they had once held long since dried up, leaving grey and brown remnants. Curiously, I opened the fridge, then immediately closed it as a smell struck my face and made my eyes water. I walked to the rest of the house, seeing dirty laundry, empty bottles of alcohol, and generally the signs of a house that was being lived in, not a house that had been vacated. The scent grew stronger as I approached the bedroom, terrified to see what was on the other side of the door, but knowing I had no other choice if I intended to get answers. I turned the knob and stepped in. It was a boy's bedroom, presumably the bedroom of Austin Francis. Again, I found more indications that nobody had packed anything away. A television, a PlayStation, video games, model cars, things that no boy would leave behind. But none of that was what surprised me. What surprised me were the black splatters of dried blood and tissue and fragments of bone that covered the walls, spreading from the bed like the boy had gone to bed with a belly full of explosives. Not for the first time since entering the house, I swallowed back hot bile from the pit of my stomach. I closed the bedroom door, thinking then to wipe my fingerprints from the knob, then moved along to the master bedroom, where I saw a similar scene. Both Mr. and Mrs. Francis were lying in bed, except their heads had been removed from their bodies and replaced with a similar arc of blood and grey matter painting the pillows, walls, and headboard. After that, I'd seen what I needed to see and left the house in a haze. Once the door behind me was closed, I lost the battle with my stomach and lurched violently in the overgrown rose bushes that were planted a few feet away from the back door. How long ago had it been since the Francis family allegedly moved? I wasn't sure. It had definitely been over a year, probably closer to 2. I racked my brain as I made my way further down the street towards Orion House, trying to remember every detail I could about how the information had travelled to Hannah about the families having moved. She'd been the one to tell me on both accounts. She had said she'd got the information from Tammy Howell, the woman next door, who had little better to do than talk on the phone and look out of the window. Why would Tammy lie about the Francis family moving? Or had she honestly thought that that's what had happened, in similar fashion to how Preston's own father seemed to honestly think he'd never had a son? The Ryan house looked better kept from the outside, although not by much. Weeds had overtaken the lawn, and one of the windows had been broken, presumably by a rock thrown from the street. I again attempted to peer through the windows, but after a few fruitless endeavours, I let myself into the backyard to try my luck with the back door. Again, it opened without a problem. The stench that hit my nose was far less potent than the one lingering in the Francis household, but equally as unnerving. Even still, I expected to find the similar signs of abandonment that I'd found in the other house, but when I flipped on my phone's light, I was surprised to see a somewhat clean, empty house. A layer of dust and dirt covered most of the surfaces, and there was no furniture, no pictures, nothing to indicate that the house was being lived in. It seemed that the house really had been vacated. Except for the smell. I followed the smell to a bedroom and opened the door. Again, I had to choke back the urge to evacuate whatever was left in my stomach. My eyes watered as I lifted the light to illuminate the boy's bedroom. This time, instead of the whole room being painted with blood, only half of it was. Lying in the bed were the remains of Kenny Ryan. His left half was perfectly intact, his grey skin taut and dry against his skeleton, while his right half was completely missing. It looked as if he'd fallen sideways into a wood chipper. Unlike the rest of the house, this room seemed completely untouched. There were no signs of any intention of packing up Kenny's possessions from the upcoming move. In fact, it seemed as if the family had simply forgotten him. It was with this thought that my heart dropped even further. They really had forgotten about Kenny. He hadn't disappeared like Preston, but he may as well have in the hearts and minds of his family. Is that what Sarah had been trying to do to the Ryan family the year before? There was no way to know for sure. I had no intention of asking her, but that seemed to fit in a morbid sort of way. After spending another few weeks fully processing what I'd found, I shared my discovery with Hannah. I was a bit nervous to pull her deeper into the problem. She had always struggled with keeping things from Sarah, but I felt like the secret would devour me if I kept it any longer. The start of the school year was fast approaching, and Hannah and I were obsessing over the decision whether or not to allow Sarah to enroll for another year. We were terrified that something else would happen, especially given what I'd found out about the Ryan and Francis families. But we also wanted to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sarah. And if I'm being honest, Hannah and I needed a break from the constant buzz of danger and unease that followed our daughter and how now coated every surface of our house. We hadn't yet made our decision, but decided it was for the best for Sarah to go to orientation at least. We decided I would go with her to see how she did, if anyone came up to her, to ask her how her summer was, or to find out if there were others like Preston Jarvis on Sarah's chopping block. Nobody approached her, but there was also no bullying either. All things considered, I took it as a win. When we arrived home, Hannah was gone. She'd left a note telling us she'd gotten a call from the neighbour who needed help with something and would be back late. This struck me as odd, but I did my best to not think about that, just in case Sarah was listening in from her bedroom, which she'd made a beeline to the moment we arrived home. Later that night, I received a text from Hannah asking if Sarah was asleep. I told her she was, and Hannah walked in the front door, face red and eyes swollen. She started, then began sobbing. I held her and let her tears soak into my shirt until eventually she calmed down enough to speak. "I'm so scared," she finally whispered. "Scared of what?" I asked, knowing damn well what she was afraid of. I was afraid too. "I found something," Hannah said, pulling away from me. She swallowed, and I could see her throat bob up and down as she searched for the words. "When you and Sarah left for orientation, I went through her bedroom. I didn't want to say anything about it because I hated when my parents would go through my room, and I had hoped I wouldn't find anything." She paused for a long moment. "But," I said, filling the silence and searching her eyes for an answer, "what did you find?" She shook her head, unable to speak, then pulled out her phone and handed it to me. On the screen was a picture she'd taken of an old stained shoebox. Inside was a collection of tails from a variety of animals, some of them very old and brittle, others fairly fresh with meat and sinew still clinging on from where they were torn off. This pile of tails sat in a nest composed of dozens of blood-stained collars and pet tags. I looked up in shock and disbelief. "I found that in her closet," Hannah said. "Go to the next picture." I swiped to the left and saw the image of an open book. It took me a moment, but I recognised it as a journal Sarah had received from one of her grandmothers last Christmas. Pasted inside the journal were photographs, each with a large X scratched across their faces. I zoomed in and recognised immediately the face of Preston Jarvis. Like this picture, many of them appeared to have been cut out from the school yearbook. I recognised the face of Sarah's science teacher that had requested she be transferred out of her class, and another girl I'd seen just a few weeks before, hopping along on crutches at the 4th of July parade. I swiped again and saw another page filled with photos. Another swipe, and still more photos. More yearbook images of children, of teachers, family photos of Kenny Ryan and Austin Francis, presumably stolen off the walls of their now vacant homes. Pictures of therapists who had mysteriously stopped returning our calls. I looked up at Hannah, my face now completely void of colour. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need to, because we both understood, at that moment, that our daughter had been doing these things for far longer than we knew, and she had kept them a secret for just as long. For years, while we thought we were getting through to her, keeping her talents at bay and teaching her right from wrong, Sarah had been torturing, killing, and erasing dozens of people and pets throughout the neighbourhood. While I've been so engrossed in explaining what happened all those years ago, things have been going on these past few weeks that have both Hannah and myself even more on edge than we were before, starting with what happened at the Red Trailer truck stop. Below is a news article I read this morning, May 4th, 2022. It's been just over 3 weeks now since Esteban Gutierrez arrived at the Red Trailer truck stop, where he worked as a line cook, to discover the 9 bodies of his friends, patrons and co-workers, and still authorities are baffled. Mr. Gutierrez told police he arrived at approximately 5:45 a.m. for his morning shift in the kitchen when he first discovered the body of Emma Fitzgerald by the employee entrance. He noticed an injury on Emma's forehead, which the county coroner determined was likely caused by a fall very near the time of death. All 8 other bodies showed signs of trauma similar to what Mr. Gutierrez described, although the coroner report shows that none of the injuries were enough to be fatal. As reported previously, the preliminary investigation reported no signs of violence or theft, nor was there anything indicating signs of a gas leak in the truck stop. Authorities have now completed the final autopsies on the individuals and are now reporting that these deaths do not appear to have been caused by poison or infection. Police and city medical professionals continue to be baffled by this peculiar case, but assure us there does not appear to be any danger to the community at this time. Check back here for the most up-to-date information on this baffling case.